as aesthetic judgment on the value of the work. Whether a person has good taste is an example of common aesthetic judgment. We're going to flip the page to 280. Logic is the branch of philosophy that deals with reasoning. One of the fundamental qualities that distinguishes human beings from animals is that humans can think. The pursuit of logic is an attempt to think clearly and avoid vagueness and contradictions. Certain rules of logic have been identified, and they constitute the core of this branch of philosophy. Logic focuses on the reasoning and modes of arguing that bring us to valid conclusions. A primary task of schools is to help children think clearly and communicate logically. Two types of reasoning are commonly taught in schools: deductive and inductive. In deductive reasoning, teachers present a general proposition and then illustrate it with a series of particulars. The most highly developed from this approach is the classical method of the syllogism. In a syllogism, one makes two statements and then a third statement. A conclusion is deduced or drawn for them. For instance, all human beings are mortal. I am a human being, therefore I am mortal. In this kind of deductive reasoning, the general proposition and abstract concept is followed by the factual statement, which in turn leads to the new factual statement and the creation of new knowledge, at least for the learners. As another example, imagine that in October, Mrs. Wells, a 5th grade teacher, writes the following statement to the board: all trees that shed their leaves at the end of the growing season are decadus trees. As a 2-week project, Mrs. Wells then takes a class to observe and record data about trees that surround the school. For 2 weeks, the students observe 3 dozen maple trees shedding their leaves during the fall. The teacher then writes her earlier sentence on the board again: all trees that shed their leaves at the end of the growing season are decadus trees. Using the observational data, the students complete the syllogism: maple trees shed their leaves at the end of the growing season, therefore maple trees are decadus. Then the students try to identify other types of trees that fit the decadus classification. Much of what teachers do in school focuses on helping children both acquire the intellectual habits of deductive thinking and expand their storehouse of knowledge through the process. Then we have inductive reasoning. Works in the opposite fashion. With this type of reasoning, teachers set forth particulars from which a general proposition is derived or induced. For instance, a teacher may wish to lead students to the discovery that water is essential to plant growth. He gives each child 2 similar plants, and then has each student daily feed one plant with water and leave the other plant without water. After 10 days, the teacher, we're going to go to page 281 now, the teacher has the students report on the conditions of their plants. From all of these individual reports, he leads the students to generalize about the necessity of water in plant life. In fact, they have induced their answer. Although the deductive and inductive forms of reasoning are opposites, both are essential to logical thought and therefore need to be developed in learners. Effective teachers design a variety of learning activities, some of which help students think deductively and others that focus on inductive reasoning. Logic is not conformed to inductive and deductive reasoning. To think logically means to think clearly in many different ways. Teachers need logic in many aspects of work, from trying to understand the behavior of a child that seems to have an erratic learning pattern, to developing tests and accurately measure what has been taught in the course. Most of all, teachers need to model this clear, logical thinking for students. Overall, the 4 branches of philosophy, metapsychics, epistemology, axiology, and logic, address some of the major concerns of teachers. We now consider the answers they suggest to teachers and the implications that they have for the actual classroom practice. Now that you know the philosophical lay of the land, and before we explore the dominant philosophies of education that exist in our schools, it is time to pause and reflect. What are your deepest beliefs and attitudes about teaching students, and what should be learned? This short inventory allows you to bring current philosophy of education to the surface. We say current philosophy of education because the philosophies of many educators go through change, and sometimes quite drastic change. As a result, study, classroom experience are both answers to the philosophical statements in a self-inventory and questions that pepper the preceding section have almost infinite variety over the years. However, certain answers by particular philosophers have received more attention and allegiance than others. These more enduring sets of answers or worldviews represent schools of philosophy. Some started with early Greek philosophers and have grown and evolved through the centuries. Other schools of thought are more recent developments and offer fresh new formulations to ultimate questions. In this section, we describe four philosophers that had a major influence on American education and demonstrate a variety of ways in which teaching and learning can be convinced. Be aware that many important philosophies relevant to education are not included here. Among them are Neo-Thomism, existentialism, and classical Eastern thought such as Zen Buddhism and Confucianism. In addition, some major educational ideas do not quite qualify as philosophies, but are nevertheless having a major impact on schools. The four philosophies discussed in the length of this chapter are perennialism, essentialism, romanticism, and progressivism. Behind these rather daunting words are very different ideas of what people are. We elected to cover these philosophies not because they are the top four philosophical hits, but because each viewpoint has extended a major influence on American educational thought and practice. We're now going to flip over, and we're going to be on the top of page 283. We have grounded these philosophies based on whether they are subject-centered or child-centered. For each philosophy, we present first a brief explanation of its origins and the core ideas and embodies, followed by its implications of teaching and learning, and then a personal point of view by a teacher who is committed to the particular philosophy. These positions are not just windly abstractions or a preoccupatious of ivory tower thinkers. Rather, they have particular implications of learning, shaping what people teach and how they teach it. The first two schools of philosophy, perennialism and essentialism, stress the importance of subject matter knowledge in education. Both schools of thought show a strong allegiance to the curriculum, and both argue a well-educated student should possess a defined body of knowledge. Also, both often get a bum rap, being labeled as teacher-centered. The label teacher-centered conjures up images of an authoritarian teacher turning himself or herself into the center of attention, making all the decisions and attempting to control everything that goes on in the classroom. Clearly, authoritarianism and ego-tripping can hide behind each of the four philosophies we will explore. Although they are convinced of the importance of certain knowledge, subject-centered teachers and passionately committed to student learning. Perennialism, which is derived primarily from the writings of Plato, views truth and nature, in particular human nature, as constant, objective, and unchanging beneath the superficial differences from one century or decade to the next. The rules that govern the world and the characteristics that make up human nature stay the same. The purpose of life, according to Plato, is the search for these constant and changeless truths which reside in the nature of things. This search is achieved through the Socratic dialogue or dialect, a process in which ideas are debated in a back-and-forth discussion until some recognizable clarity is reached. Essential to undertaking such a pursuit is mental discipline and rational thought process. Perennialists view education as crucial because it develops a person's mental discipline and rationality, which is necessary to the search for truths that will help humans avoid being dominated by the instructional side of human nature. Perennialism in the school. For perennialists, the purpose of education is to find The changeless truth, which is the best revealed in the enduring classics of Western culture, according to this